The phone call came without warning. No press release, no carefully worded statement from Kensington Palace, no royal aide dispatched ahead of time to smooth the diplomatic waters. Just a direct, private conversation between two members of the House of Windsor who had, for years, maintained a careful and deliberately measured distance from one another. But this was not a moment for careful measures. This was not a moment for the kind of softly spoken, expertly managed communication that the British royal family has spent centuries perfecting. This was a moment for something the palace has always feared more than any tabloid headline, more than any tell-all memoir, more than any rebellious interview broadcast to a global audience of hundreds of millions. This was a moment for truth. When Princess Anne picked up that phone and heard the voice of her nephew, Prince William, the future King of England, on the other end of the line, something shifted, not merely between two individuals, not merely between two royals who have always shared a quiet mutual respect, built on shared values and shared losses, but across the entire architecture of the British monarchy itself. What passed between them in that conversation has never been fully confirmed, never officially acknowledged, never carefully entered into the public record by the palace press machine that controls so much of what the world is permitted to know about life inside these ancient institutions. But the consequences of whatever was said, the consequences of whatever agreement was reached, whatever alliance was forged, whatever line was drawn in that private and unreported exchange, have been utterly impossible to ignore. Buckingham Palace insiders, speaking through the careful intermediaries that royal journalism has always depended upon, have described the days and weeks that followed as nothing short of a complete institutional collapse. Senior courtiers reportedly scrambling. Advisors calling emergency meetings in rooms that the press are never invited into. The communications apparatus of one of the world's most powerful and most scrutinized royal households thrown into a state of visible, measurable disarray. Because when Princess Anne and Prince William decide to move in the same direction, when the most institutionally credible of the late Queen's children and the heir to the throne decide that they have had enough, nothing in the royal world stays the same for long. And at the center of all of it, as she almost always is, even now, even nearly 3 decades after her death on a Paris road in the early hours of an August morning, was Diana. Welcome to Crown Outlook, the channel that goes deeper than the headlines, behind the palace walls, and into the stories that the establishment would very much prefer you never heard. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because what we are about to walk you through is unlike almost anything we have covered before, and you do not want to miss a single word of it. To truly understand why this particular moment carries the extraordinary weight that it does, you have to go back. Not just a few months, not just to the most recent wave of royal controversies that have kept the tabloids and the broadsheets and the YouTube channels and the podcasts fed and furious for the past several years. You have to go back much further than that. You have to go back to the very foundations of what the British monarchy has become over the last half-century, and, perhaps more importantly, to what it repeatedly, stubbornly, often culpably refused to become, even when history handed it every possible opportunity to evolve, to open, to be honest with itself and with the public it exists to serve. Princess Anne, formerly known as Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise, the Princess Royal, is the second child of the late Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Born on the 15th of August, 1950, she has spent her entire life occupying a role that the British public has never quite been able to fully pin down or comfortably categorize. She is not the sovereign, she is not the heir, she is not the kind of glamorous, photographed, endlessly discussed princess that the tabloid press constructs its entire commercial model around. She is something considerably more interesting than any of those things, and in many ways, something considerably more dangerous. She is the member of the royal family who has always operated as though she genuinely, completely, and without performance does not care what you think of her. Anne's reputation for directness, for the kind of bluntness that in any other context would simply be called honesty, is the stuff of genuine royal legend. She has, on the public record, told a press photographer to naff off in terms that required no further elaboration. She declined personal protection officers for extended periods, considering the security apparatus an unnecessary imposition on her ability to simply get on with things. She has carried out more official royal engagements than virtually any other working member of the family in any given year, decade after decade, without ever seeking, and without ever quite receiving the same volume of press adulation lavished upon her siblings or their children. She is respected within the institution in a way that very few royals are. She is also feared within it in a way that even fewer are. Her directness is understood by those who work alongside her and those who have spent careers studying the internal dynamics of the palace to be simultaneously her greatest institutional asset, and, for anyone foolish enough to position themselves against her, something that functions very much like a weapon. Now place her alongside Prince William, the Prince of Wales, the future King of England, a man who carries his mother's memory and his mother's mission in one hand, and the full, crushing, unavoidable weight of an ancient institution in the other. A man who has spent the better part of the last several years making it quietly, but with gathering and unmistakable clarity, absolutely clear that he is finished playing by the old rules. The rules that say you do not speak about certain things. The rules that say the institution always comes before the individual. The rules that were used systematically and over years to diminish, isolate, and ultimately destroy the woman who was his mother. William has watched what the palace did to Diana. He has watched it not as a distant observer, not as a historian reading documents, but as a son who was there, who lived inside it, who experienced the consequences of it in the most personal and permanent way imaginable. He has watched the institution close ranks around itself again and again. He has watched it manage narratives with the cold efficiency of an organization that has had centuries of practice at exactly that skill. He has watched it protect itself. He has seen things. He has heard things. He knows things that the public is only now, slowly, incompletely beginning to understand. And he has reached a point, a specific, definable, documented point, where patience is simply no longer available to him as an option. When these two personalities, Anne's fearless, unimpeachable institutional authority, and William's wounded, determined, increasingly urgent mission to honor what was done to his mother, when these two forces decide to converge upon a single objective, what you do not get is a skirmish. What you do not get is a politely worded letter of concern submitted through the appropriate channels and filed quietly away. What you get, what the palace is currently discovering it has on its hands, is a reckoning of a kind it has not faced before, and for which it has, remarkably, no adequate plan. The seeds of this particular and extraordinary storm were not planted overnight. They were not the product of a single argument, a single revelation, a single piece of information that changed everything in an instant. They were sown across years, across decades even, of accumulated grievance and institutional silence, and the particular, suffocating, corrosive kind of palace politics that operates entirely on the central principle that nothing is ever said directly when it can be managed, delayed, carefully diluted, or simply buried beneath layers of procedural complexity until the people demanding answers are too exhausted or too old or simply no longer here to keep demanding them. Diana's death in August of 1997 did not end the questions. Anyone who believed it might, anyone within the palace who exhaled and thought that the worst was over, that the story could now be managed from a safe historical distance, profoundly misjudged what Diana meant and what her memory would continue to mean. Her death did not close the file. It multiplied the questions contained within it. The years that followed produced a cascade of revelations that came not all at once, but in waves, each one receding just long enough for the palace to believe it had weathered the storm before the next arrived larger than the last. The Dyson Inquiry of 2021, which investigated the circumstances under which Martin Bashir obtained his landmark 1995 Panorama interview with Diana, concluded in terms that were as clear as they were damning. Bashir had used fabricated bank statements. He had exploited Diana's vulnerabilities. He had, in the language of the inquiry, deceived her. The BBC issued its apology. The public registered its outrage. And the palace, in its characteristic fashion, managed its response with the kind of careful restraint that William had long since stopped being able to interpret as anything other than a deliberate strategy of self-protection. What changed in the specific period leading up to the convergence between Anne and William was not one thing but a sequence of things, a series of events that insider accounts, pieced together from multiple sources across the royal press corps, suggest pushed William past a breaking point he had been managing, carefully and with enormous personal cost, for a very long time. The first element was the publication of certain royal biographies, some authorized by elements of the palace itself, others bitterly contested, all of them widely read, that portrayed the late Princess of Wales in terms that those close to William found not merely inaccurate in their details, but deliberately and systematically diminishing in their overall effect. The portrait these books constructed was of a woman who was difficult, unstable, unreliable, a woman whose own behavior had contributed substantially to her undoing. The palace said nothing to challenge these characterizations. It managed nothing. It allowed the narrative to settle into the public consciousness like sediment settling to the bottom of still water. The second shift was Harry. Whatever one thinks, and opinions on this subject are fierce and divided and show no sign of converging. Whatever one thinks of Prince Harry's very public and very costly separation from the institution, his departure had a consequence that the palace had not adequately anticipated. It forced the institution to take explicit, on-the-record positions on questions about Diana's treatment that it had previously been able to leave comfortably ambiguous. Statements were made, lines were drawn publicly rather than managed privately. And some of those lines, from William's perspective, were drawn in places that were not merely strategically wrong, but morally indefensible. The third element, the one that palace sources, in the careful, deniable language of background briefings, consistently identify as the true and immediate catalyst for what followed, was a decision made somewhere within the senior echelons of royal governance about how certain historical records pertaining to Diana's time as Princess of Wales were to be handled going forward. Not released, not reviewed, not open to independent scrutiny, archived, classified, kept from public access not for a decade, not for a generation, but for a span of time that would ensure that the vast majority of people alive today would be dead before any of it became available. William became aware of this decision. His reaction, by the accounts of those close to him who have spoken carefully and off the record to journalists in a position to report it, was not measured. It was not the careful, calibrated, institutionally appropriate response of a man who has spent his life learning to suppress his own feelings in service of a role. It was the reaction of a son. He began making calls. And one of the first calls he made, significantly, deliberately, tellingly, was to his aunt. What happened next has been described, in various ways and with various emphases, by various sources who exist at various points of proximity to the palace, as a confrontation, as a coordinated campaign, as an act of royal defiance so significant in its implications that it sent genuine shockwaves through an institution that had long since convinced itself it was beyond the reach of anything so disruptive. The truth, as it so often is in stories this complex and this consequential, appears to contain elements of all three descriptions simultaneously. Anne and William met privately. No aides present. No press secretaries hovering at the edge of the conversation, ready to manage and translate and soften. No carefully curated guest lists. No scheduled breaks to allow for consultation. None of the elaborate apparatus of managed royal communication that normally surrounds any interaction between senior members of the family at this level. Just the two of them, in a setting that even the most well-sourced and well-connected royal correspondents have been unable to pin down with complete certainty, though multiple independent sources point toward Gatcombe Park, Anne's private estate in the Gloucestershire countryside, as the most probable location. What was said between them in that room, what understanding was reached, what specific commitments were made, and what precise strategy was agreed upon, no one outside that conversation can say with any certainty. But what followed in the days and weeks after tells its own extraordinarily detailed story, and that story has been anything but ambiguous. Within days of that meeting taking place, a coordinated series of actions began to unfold across multiple fronts simultaneously. William's team, the most trusted and most capable members of his Kensington Palace advisory structure, began the formal, documented process of engaging directly with the inquiry mechanisms and the institutional oversight bodies that hold legitimate authority over how historical royal records are classified, stored, and made available. This was not a quiet word whispered into the right ear at the right private dinner. This was not a suggestion floated through intermediaries and deniable if it attracted unwanted attention. This was a formal, structured, on-the-record challenge to decisions that had been made at the highest levels of the royal household by people who had assumed those decisions were, in practice, unchallengeable. Simultaneously, and with the kind of coordination that speaks to a level of prior planning that went beyond any single conversation, Princess Anne began making her own presence felt in the spaces where royal policy is genuinely and substantively shaped. Sources within the palace structure describe a period during which Anne became notably, unmistakably more vocal in the private meetings and internal conversations where decisions about the institution's direction are actually made. Not the public engagements, not the carefully staged appearances, but the real conversations, the ones that never make it into any press release. She pressed, with the directness that is her defining characteristic, the case for transparency regarding Diana's legacy and Diana's treatment, for accountability regarding what had been done with historical records, for an honest institutional reckoning with a chapter of royal history that the palace had spent nearly 30 years attempting to close without ever properly opening. Coming from Anne, from the Princess Royal, from the late Queen's most institutionally committed child, from the royal family member whose entire public identity is built on the foundation of duty and service, and never, ever playing to the gallery, this carried a weight that nothing and nobody else in the royal constellation could have provided. She is not someone who makes noise. She is not someone who creates drama, because drama serves her interests. She is not someone who has ever positioned herself as a reformer, or a disruptor, or an agent of institutional change. She is someone who has spent her entire adult life defending and upholding the institution she was born into. And that is precisely why, when she now says that the institution has failed, when she says it in private, in the meetings that matter, to the people with the power to act, the effect is not merely significant, it is seismic. What William and Anne were pressing for, the specific objective around which their combined and considerable institutional weight was now focused, related to materials, to documents, to correspondence and records, and formally documented communications from the period of Diana's marriage, from the years of her most acute isolation within the institution, from the aftermath of her separation and divorce, and from the final period of her life before the Paris Tunnel. Materials which, it has been credibly suggested by multiple sources, contain information that does not merely add nuance to the existing narrative, but fundamentally and uncomfortably complicates it. That challenges, in specific and documented ways, the version of events that the palace has preferred to maintain and to project for nearly 3 decades. William wants these materials seen, not necessarily released to the public in their entirety, not immediately, not without process, but reviewed by independent eyes, examined by people with no institutional stake in what they find, removed from the classification that currently keeps them sealed behind timelines so long that accountability becomes not merely difficult, but structurally impossible. The palace's initial response to this pressure was the response that every bureaucratic institution gives when it is not yet certain how serious the challenge it faces actually is. It delayed, it reviewed, it considered. It assembled working groups and scheduled consultations, and produced the kind of procedural activity that looks from a distance like progress, and from up close is indistinguishable from standing completely still. But delay is a tactic that functions only when the people applying the pressure are willing, ultimately, to accept delay as an answer. William is not willing, Anne is not willing, and that unwillingness, expressed through the specific and legitimate channels available to 2 senior members of the royal family, with the credibility and the institutional standing to use them effectively, has left the palace facing a situation it genuinely does not know how to manage. The fallout from what Anne and William have set in motion has been, by any honest measure, extraordinary in its scale and unsettling in its implications for an institution that has prided itself, across centuries, on its ability to absorb pressure and emerge fundamentally unchanged. Perhaps the single most telling indicator of the true magnitude of the impact is not any specific action that has been publicly reported, not any statement issued, or any policy changed, or any record reclassified. The most telling indicator is the nature of the response from within the palace itself, or rather, the desperate and fractured and frequently self-contradicting nature of that response. Institutions reveal themselves most clearly and most honestly not in their moments of calm, but in their moments of pressure. And Buckingham Palace, subjected to the pressure of 2 of its most significant members demanding genuine accountability around Diana's legacy, has revealed itself to be deeply and structurally unprepared for this particular moment in a way that no amount of institutional spin can entirely conceal. Multiple senior courtiers, according to accounts reaching royal journalists through the careful and deniable channels that the palace press ecosystem has always operated through, have been engaged in emergency consultations of a kind not seen within these walls for years. The language that has filtered through from these consultations is itself revealing. One insider, speaking on the condition of complete anonymity to a journalist with a long and credible track record of accuracy on palace matters, reportedly described what is happening as the most serious internal challenge to palace communications strategy in the post-Diana era. Read those words carefully. Absorb what they actually say. They are not describing this as a policy disagreement between family members with different views on how historical records should be managed. They are not describing it as a dispute between a nephew and his aunt about the appropriate pace of institutional reform. They are describing it as a challenge to their communications strategy, to their ability to control the narrative, to their capacity to manage the story in the way the palace has always managed it, from the inside out, through briefings and counter-briefings and carefully timed releases of carefully selected information that frames every development in the most institutionally favorable light possible. And that control, that capacity that the palace has relied upon so completely and for so long that it has perhaps stopped fully appreciating how central it is to everything the institution does, appears, for the first time in a generation, to be genuinely, measurably, perhaps irrecoverably slipping. The people who built their careers on the assumption that the Diana chapter was closed, that whatever uncomfortable truths lay within it, had been sufficiently managed and sufficiently buried that they would never resurface in a form that demanded a real institutional response. Those people are now navigating a reality that contradicts every assumption their careers were built upon. The winners in this story, if we are going to use the language of winners and losers, and in the context of something this serious, about something this consequential, that language feels insufficient. But if we are going to use it, the winners are identifiable. William gains, in whatever outcome this process ultimately produces, something that he has been seeking not merely for months or years, but for the better part of his adult life: institutional acknowledgement that the way Diana was treated by the family and the household she married into demands something more than managed silence and the slow passage of time. He gains the beginning, at least, of a process that might eventually produce the kind of honest accounting that he believes his mother deserves, and that the public, which loved her with an intensity the institution never fully understood, has every right to. Anne gains confirmation of something she has long privately believed, but has until now expressed only within the boundaries of appropriate institutional behavior: that the monarchy cannot survive indefinitely on the model of control and concealment that has served it through the 20th century, that adaptation is not weakness but necessity, and that the people who resist it are not protecting the institution, but accelerating its eventual unraveling. And Diana, her memory, her legacy, the specific and documented truth of what she experienced during those years inside an institution that was never designed for someone like her. Diana gains the one thing she was almost never afforded during her lifetime and has been systematically denied since her death. She gains the serious, structural, consequential attention of the people who actually have the power to do something about it. What comes next in a story that has been building, in one form or another, for nearly 3 decades, a story that has outlasted governments and prime ministers and public patience and the institutional machinery deployed repeatedly and expensively to contain it? The honest answer, the only responsible answer, is that we are in the middle of it. We are standing at a point in this narrative where the pressure has been applied, where the alliances have been formed, where the challenge has been issued, but where the full consequences have not yet resolved themselves into outcomes that can be clearly reported and neatly understood. This story is not finished. It is not even close to finished. But there are things we can say with confidence, grounded in what we know and what credible sources have confirmed and what the observable behavior of the institution itself has demonstrated. The internal dynamic of the British royal family has shifted in ways that are measurable and material, and that will shape how this institution operates, how it presents itself, and how it is perceived for years and perhaps decades to come. William is not going to stop. This is not a campaign of frustration that will dissipate when he gets busy with other things. Those who have watched him carefully over the course of his adult life, who have tracked the evolution of his public positions and his private commitments, describe with consistency a man who has made a clear-eyed and fully considered peace with the understanding that defending his mother's legacy and pursuing honest accountability for what was done to her will cost him, in political capital within the institution, in the goodwill of advisors and courtiers whose cooperation he needs for other things, in the carefully maintained relationships that allow the machinery of constitutional monarchy to keep functioning without open crisis. He has weighed that cost. He has decided it is worth paying. And he has found in Princess Anne an ally who brings to this cause the single thing that he, despite everything he is and everything he represents, cannot provide for himself: the unimpeachable, decades-long, never-questioned credibility of the royal family member who has always, in every circumstance, at every point of pressure, put the institution first. When that person, when Anne, stands up in the rooms that matter and says that the institution has gotten this wrong, what does the institution say back? What does any institution do when its most loyal and most credible defender becomes, on a specific and fundamental point of principle, its most credible critic? That is the question that is keeping the people who run Buckingham Palace awake in the small hours. That is the question that has no clean answer and no easy resolution, and it is a question that we, watching from the outside, from beyond the palace gates, with no stake in what the answer is, except the stake that comes from simply believing that truth matters, it is a question we should be asking loudly and without apology. What do you believe Diana would make of this moment? Of her son standing firm in her name after all these years? Of her former sister-in-law choosing principle over the institutional comfort of silence? And do you think the palace will ever truly, fully, honestly reckon with what was done to her, or will the machinery of self-protection ultimately prove, as it has so many times before, too powerful and too deeply embedded to be overcome even by the people who sit inside it? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and the conversation that happens there matters to us. And if this is the kind of deep, unfiltered, unsparing royal analysis that you want more of, then subscribe to Crown Outlook right now. Turn on your notifications so you never miss what we put out, and stay with us, because this story, as we have said, is nowhere near its ending, not even close.